All right, we are moving right along. So we finished all 4 sections of the logic. So we've gone through all of these now on our channel. Now we're going to start here in the data section. So today's episode is obviously the create records element. That's why you clicked on it. And before we jump into the usual stuff here, I'm just going to bring you on over here to my portfolio/blog. You can check this place out. It's got, Salesforce tips, business application tips like Slack and Zapier and things like that. We have a podcast around FAQ in Salesforce. So, what's compensation look like? What are certifications all about? What kind of roles are there available? I also have just like my own personal blog of just things that I'm writing about, things I'm trying to do better to improve my career. So yeah, feel free to check this out. I guess the best part about it, why I'm directing you here though, is for every single YouTube video that I do, podcast that I do, I'm going to throw up a blog post. And in that blog post, it will have all this documentation that you're looking for. So if you're the type of person that would rather read this type of information versus watch it, feel free to jump over here. I include screenshots and you should be able to figure it out from that kind of stuff. Another good example of this would be you watch the video and you're like me where you're like, okay, I don't want to rewatch this entire thing to just figure out what he said about, this part of it. I don't want to sit there and try to skip through the video to watch that over and over. If that's you and you just want to watch it once to see it live and then use the documentation, you can always jump over here too. So if that's you at this point in the video, feel free to jump over here. We're going to dive into the video. Okay. So we're talking about create records, looking at that element. Rule number 1 that I always like to bring up is just words of caution that we have to be aware of as we go through this together. And in our case today, we just got to make sure that when we're using this create records element, that we're looking for all the values that actually need to be populated on the specific object. In our case, the business use case, when an account is moved to the account rating of hot, we want to create a new opportunity and then relate it over to that account. So we kind of have 2 things going on there, right? We were basically looking at the account object. And on the account object, when something happens, some type of trigger happens, in our case, it's going to be moving this account rating to hot. We want a new opportunity created. There's probably several ways to do this. We're going to use a flow because that's what we're trying to describe here and how to use this create records element. I'm not super interested in these videos of getting into something crazy as a business use case and make it super complex. I'm here to just basically explain this is how this element works. This is a basic functionality behind it. This is how you can use it. So that's the purpose of this video. That's why it's super simple here. So we have that one part happening right on the account where there's this trigger. It's going to move to hot. And then once it moves to hot, we want a new opportunity to be created. And then we want it to relate back to the account. So not only are we going to use a create record to make that opportunity, but then we're also going to be using an update element, obviously, so that we can relate it back to this account. So what we have here is if the account rating is hot, then create a new opportunity and relate that opportunity to the existing account that was triggered, that was worked on to cause this whole thing to happen in the first place. So our design features, we're going to have a auto launch flow. Auto launch flow, if you're new to that vocabulary, is a flow that is triggered off of something. So you're not actually starting the flow. There's something like a screen flow that you could use that would actually trigger this process by like a button. You could attach your flow to a button, and then when you click the button, it will start the flow. Or you can use something like an auto launch, and the auto launch is based on, something happens and it gets invoked by another process. In our case, that process is our account process builder. So we're saying, hey, on the account process builder, take a look at the account rating. And if that's changed and it's changed to hot, then invoke this flow, kick off this flow for us. So that's what that means. Kind of covered this by just talking about that. We have our account process builder, right, that is going to invoke our flow, kick it off for us. From there, we are going to push in our record ID variable. So that account that is worked on and has the account rating changed to hot, we want to take the record ID of that account and push it into one of our variables in the actual flow. If you're kind of new to variables and you're not sure what that means, a variable is just kind of think of it like a box. That's the way I like to think of it. You put something inside that box, you label that box, whatever the heck you want to name it, and then it stores something in there, stores some type of value. That value is then used throughout our flow. So in our case, we're pushing the record ID, which is this, right? We have our record ID. And what it's going to do is it's going to take this value and it's going to put it inside of that box that we named record ID, which is right here. So we have this box called record ID. It's going to store that value inside of this. And then when we get into our flow, we have that record ID right here. And it will be used to relate stuff and all that throughout our flow, which is really nice. So great. We have our record ID. We got our variable, create records. Okay. So the next couple elements in the flow, we're obviously creating records. That's the entire point of this video. So creating records, we're going to create an opportunity. And then we're going to actually update the records, right? So we want to relate this back to the account that kicked it all off so that this works. All right. Cool. So we have a good understanding of what's going on this page. Let's jump over to our account actually, and let's take a look at this together too. So we have a space right here for our opportunity to be related. It's a lookup field. I could go in here and I could, type for whatever and look for that opportunity and relate it. And that's what we actually want to be auto-populated through this flow. So after it creates a new opportunity, that's great, but then we want it to be related to this account. So that name is actually going to pop up here after the flow runs. Then we also have our account rating that I keep referring to. It's a pick list. You have all these different values you can select. And basically what we want it to do is just like I selected cold, we want it to, when I move it to hot and change it, we want that flow to run. So that's kind of our two triggers, the two things we're worried about on the actual account. Let's see, the process builder. I quickly ran you through this, but the process builder is going to be on the account. The reason it's on the account is because we're making a change on the account. When we make a change on the account, we want something to happen. And in this case, we're looking to see, has that account rating been changed to hot? And is the account rating changed at all? So is changed and it equals hot. If those two things are true, then we want you to invoke our flow called create records. That flow, like I showed you, is going to ship in our record ID on the account and go ahead and throw that into the flow for us so we can store that value. So more or less, that's how this thing is going to work, what we're looking at. And we can probably jump over here to the flow. So I went ahead and obviously tested this to make sure it was going to work. Beforehand, it's all running right. So I will break this down. It's only 2 elements. This should be fairly quick and easy for all of us. I'm hearing zoom in here possibly. Okay, so we have our first record. First record that we want to do, this is a auto launch flow. As a reminder, right? The recap, which is our process builder's kicking that off. Cool. Send it into this flow. Let's get this flow running. And once we have this flow, the very first thing we want to do is create a record, creating that new opportunity. So we know that the account rating was changed to hot, and that fired the process in our business use case here to say, great, go ahead and create a new op for us. Now on this op, as that word of caution up here, right? We have to make sure that all of the fields that need to be populated are populated. So in this flow, one of those is the close date. This flow, if I took this field out, the flow wouldn't be able to run because this is a required field. I would get that nasty red text error that tells you something kind of vague, like your account process, management failed, or a flow couldn't execute something. And you'd have to figure out, hey, why did this happen? So the close date in our use case here is required. So I'm taking the close date on the opportunity. And how I get that, right, is I just type in close date. And this is looking at everything on the opportunity. So if we want to build this together, obviously I remember all these things. So, and I can just cancel out. We could just do something like this, right? We have our opportunity. The first thing we want to do is we want to figure out what we're doing up here, right? We have our records that we're going to create and how we're going to set those record values. Well, in our use case, it's very, very simple, and we only need to create one of these. We're not creating multiple records like you could do. We're just going to create one record. And I think if you're new to this, this is probably more where you're landing. You're probably looking at this because you haven't done a ton of flows, you're new to it, and you need to figure out how this element works. So in a lot of those cases, I felt like when I was warming up to this, I fell into this use case, which is I'm just creating one. And from that, let's just do this through separate resources and literal values. There's two different options here of how you could set those records. If I click use all values from a record, there's something that you can create called a record variable, right? And you could use that and anything that you populated in the flow into this record variable, it would use those values and create your record. That, in my opinion, for this use case that we're using is a little more advanced than I'm trying to get into. I just want to keep this nice and simple for everybody. So we're going to use separate resources and literal values. From there, it asks you, what object are you going to be creating this record on? Well, for us, we're creating this on the opportunity. Now it's saying, what is it that you want to name all these fields? Like, what do you want to set those values to? Well, we had our name, right? And for our name, we'll just title this new. Oh, I think this is new. Cool. So now we have the name of the opportunity, what we want to title it. Let's do the stage name as prospecting. And let's do that close date since we know that's required. Type in close date. And here's something cool that you can do. Obviously, I could type in a number and it would set that number every single time. Or I can go to this thing called the global variable, and it looks at when this flow is running, there's certain things that we can look at. So it says inside this flow, what do you want to set it to? Do you want to set it to the current date time, the interview start time, which is just when the flow started, or the current date? We'll just put current date. That's really nice and easy. It will always put the current date for the close date, and we can differentiate that way. And honestly, that's all we're doing in this specific element. It's pretty straightforward. The biggest thing is just making sure that you have all the required fields populated. So we hit done there. We're going to attach this. Next, we have our update element. Now, our update element, we're pretty much doing the same thing, right? And this one, it's also going to be fairly simple and straightforward. We're specifying the conditions to identify records, and then we're going to set those fields individually. So same idea. It has me check whether or not, it has me figure out what type of object I want to update. In our case, we want to update the account. So after it creates this record, we want to update this account. Now it's saying, how do we understand what account through these conditions? How do we understand what account should be updated? Well, for us, we want to take the account ID and we want to match it with the record ID. That way we know it's the exact same one. And do you guys remember that when we were showing you that earlier in this process? We're taking, right, this ID right here, which triggered this whole thing to start. We then went over to our process builder, stored it inside of our box or our variable titled record ID, which is the account ID. And then we shipped it into our flow. So now it's here. So now we know that that record is the record we want to update. So just match it with the account ID. That's what we want to do. That way it's a one-to-one, they match. Great, that's the one we got to update. Now, what do we want to update? Well, on our field over here, this is titled opportunity, and it's a lookup value. That's going to show us how it's related to the account. So over here, we want to do that same thing. We just want to find the opportunity. Great. And then we want to put in the opportunity ID. Now at this point, I did this a different way, right? I did this. I'm going to go back over to our create records and I'll show you what I did here. So this part of it makes sense of how I got this opportunity ID. So on the create records, there is something down here that we can do. You'll click on manually assign variables. And it says, where do you want to store this opportunity ID? Like in a variable. Where do you want to package this up? What type of box do you want to put this in and label it as? Okay, so what is this doing? Let's try to back up and understand what's going on here. We're creating these values. We're putting in the information. Well, if I tried up here to put in the ID, I can't put in the ID. The reason I can't put in the ID is because there's no ID created yet. When it creates that ID up here, this is what we're talking about, but it's going to be one for the opportunity. This ID is auto-generated. It creates this ID automatically. So I don't know how to update over here when I'm saying, hey, go and update the opportunity with the opportunity ID. Well, I don't know that as of right now. I don't know what that ID is going to be because it's going to auto-generate some random ID. All I know is that in order to update that field that we're talking about, which is here, I have to input the ID in the flow. I have to say, you know, this opportunity titled with this ID, that's the one we want related here. So I have to manually assign this variable. And then it's saying after we create this for you, after this element, this part right here runs for you, we will have the ID, obviously, because we created it, and we can store it somewhere for you. Cool. Well, yeah, that's what I want to do. I want to store that ID so that I can use it on the update part and update the opportunity field with this ID. So we use specifically a record variable titled opportunity. And then I just said, you know, the ID part, populate it in there. So all this is doing, if you're not super familiar with record variables, that's okay. This is super, super easy. All I'm saying is just look at the title of it. That's what I'm doing. I'm storing it inside of this box. That box is then labeled opportunity ID. Pretty straightforward. And that's exactly what I want to use. That would make sense to me. If we think of those variables or boxes, like I think I've used in a past video, the example of like a Christmas box or a decoration box, you have in your attic or your shed or something, you have a box titled Christmas decorations, right? You grab that box, you bring it into your house, and what's inside of it? A bunch of Christmas decorations. You take those out, you decorate your house. When you're done with it, you put it back inside the box labeled Christmas decorations. That's the exact same thing we're doing here. We're saying after you create this record, store it inside of a box titled opportunity ID. Great. Now it's stored. I'm bringing it into my house to this next place. And now I'm saying here, unpackage this, take out the opportunity ID and put it inside of this field titled opportunity. So that's all those two things are. And that's a use case then when you would want to manually assign the variable is if you have to access this newly created opportunity or newly created record at some other point in your flow. And in our flow, we do have to reference it. So those are those two items there. We now have those. We've updated it. Great. I don't need to do anything as far as saving because I already have all this stuff set up to work the way that I need it to. So we know that's working. We know that our process builder is working. It's activated. Let's jump on over to our test account now. Let's refresh this and let's actually test this out. So when I move this over to hot and I save it, what we want to see is that there's a new opportunity called this is new and it should be related here. And then we can click in there and we can check the close date and we can check the stage name. The stage name should equal, I think we set it to prospecting, and then the close date is obviously today. So if I hit save, all right, cool. It worked. So it related it here. Here's our new opportunity. I can click into this thing and it will bring me on over, and it says, yep, this is new. That's our opportunity we want. The close date is set to today, which is today's date. And we should see like a close date, or sorry, what was the other one? It's a stage name. Sorry. We have our stage name set to prospecting, which is what we set as well. So we know this worked. We know it ran the flow appropriately. And that's kind of a basic way that you would use the create records element.